The funeral home director hung up the phone and stared at the invoice on his desk. $4,500. The family on the other end of the line had just buried their teenage son. Car accident. They had exactly $300 in savings. There was no way they could pay for the funeral. No way they could afford the casket, the service, the burial plot. They'd done it anyway, because what choice did they have? You can't leave your child at the morgue. Robert Chen had owned Chen Family Funeral Home in Los Angeles for 15 years. He'd dealt with this situation before. Families who couldn't afford to bury their loved ones. Families who went into debt for decades to pay funeral costs. Families who had to choose between a proper burial and keeping their house. It broke his heart every time. He was about to call the family back and work out a payment plan they'd never be able to afford when his secretary knocked on his door. "Mr. Chen, there's a call for you. Line 2. Robert picked up. "Chen Funeral Home?" The voice on the other end was familiar, but Robert couldn't place it. "Mr. Chen, I understand you have a family that can't afford their son's funeral expenses." I'm sorry, who is this?" "That doesn't matter. The bill is $4,500, correct?" "Yes, but I can't discuss client finances with—" "I'm paying it, all of it. Send me the invoice. I'll have a cashier's check to you by tomorrow." "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I need to know who you are. I can't accept—" "You can and you will. The family will never know who paid. You'll tell them an anonymous donor covered the costs. Is that understood?" Robert was silent for a moment. "Who are you?" "Someone who doesn't want families to go into debt to bury their children. Send me the invoice." The caller gave an address and hung up. This was October 1970. It was the first of 47 funerals that Dean Martin would pay for over the next 17 years, and nobody knew it was him until after he died. This is the story of the most generous secret in Hollywood history, how Dean Martin spent nearly $300,000 helping families bury their loved ones, how he swore the funeral director to absolute secrecy, and how the truth only came out when Dean was gone and could no longer tell them to keep it quiet. Robert Chen was 42 years old in 1970, second-generation Chinese-American. His father had started Chen Family Funeral Home in 1945, right after World War II, serving the Chinese community in Los Angeles. Robert had grown up in the funeral business. Literally, his family lived above the funeral home. He'd helped his father prepare bodies as a teenager, learned embalming techniques, studied grief, and how to help families through the worst days of their lives. Robert had taken over the business in 1955 when his father retired. 15 years of running the funeral home. 15 years of seeing families at their most vulnerable. 15 years of watching people make impossible financial choices in the midst of overwhelming grief. He'd seen a lot in those 15 years. The single mother who chose between her daughter's funeral and keeping the electricity on. The elderly couple who had to sell their car to afford burying their son. The father who took out a loan with a predatory lender at 40% interest just to have enough money for a casket. The young widow who showed up with cash in a coffee can, $1,200 saved over 6 months of skipping meals, still $2,000 short of what she needed.
The grief of families losing children, the desperation of people who couldn't afford to bury their parents, the impossible choices people had to make when death came without warning or savings. Robert had seen it all, and it never got easier. The funeral industry in 1970 was expensive and getting more expensive every year. A basic funeral cost between $3,000 and $5,000. For working-class families making $8,000 to $12,000 a year, that was 6 months' salary or more. Most people didn't have life insurance. Most people didn't have savings accounts with thousands of dollars. When someone died unexpectedly, a car accident, a heart attack, a sudden illness, Families faced immediate financial catastrophe on top of their emotional devastation. Robert tried to help when he could. He offered payment plans that stretched for years. He reduced costs where possible, cutting his own profit margins. He sometimes donated his services entirely for families he knew couldn't pay. But he had a business to run, staff salaries to pay, mortgage on the building, supply costs, utilities, insurance. There was only so much he could do without bankrupting his own family. The mysterious phone call changed everything, changed how Robert thought about his business, changed how he thought about generosity, changed his entire understanding of what it meant to help people. The next day, a cashier's check for $4,500 arrived at the funeral home. No name on the check, just the amount and a Beverly Hills address. Robert called the family he'd spoken with the previous day. "I have some good news," Robert said. "An anonymous donor has paid your son's funeral expenses. All of them. You don't owe anything." The mother started crying. The father kept asking who. Robert said he didn't know. He was telling the truth at that point. He genuinely didn't know who had called or sent the check. 3 weeks later, it happened again. A family that couldn't afford their grandmother's funeral. Robert was working out a payment plan when the phone rang. The same voice. "Mr. Chen, I understand you have another family that needs help." This time, Robert recognized the voice. He'd heard it 1,000 times, on records, on television, in movies. But it couldn't be. Why would Dean Martin be calling about funeral expenses? "Mr. Martin?" Robert said carefully. There was a pause, then, "Mr. Chen, I need you to promise me something. You will never tell anyone that I'm doing this. Not the families, not your staff, not your wife, nobody. Can you promise me that?" Yes, but why? "Because if people know, they'll try to thank me. They'll make a big deal out of it. I don't want that. I just want families to be able to bury their loved ones without going bankrupt. That's all. Can you keep this secret?" "Yes, Mr. Martin, I can keep it secret."
Good. Send me the invoice. I'll take care of it. Over the next 17 years, Dean called Robert Chen 45 more times. Always the same pattern, always the same instruction. Send the invoice, pay it immediately. Tell the family it was an anonymous donor. Never reveal the source. Dean never explained how he knew which families needed help. Robert eventually figured out that Dean had connections throughout Los Angeles, friends, acquaintances, people who knew people. Somehow, Dean heard about families struggling with funeral costs, and he called. The amounts varied. The smallest was $2,800. The largest was $8,200. Dean paid every single bill in full, never asked for payment plans, never negotiated, just paid. Robert kept a locked filing cabinet in his office. Inside was a folder labeled DM. Nobody knew what it meant. Inside the folder were 47 invoices, 47 cashier's checks, 47 families who thought an anonymous donor had saved them from financial ruin. The total, by December 1987, was $287,340. Robert struggled with the secrecy. Families would beg him to tell them who the donor was. They wanted to say thank you. They wanted to express their gratitude. They wanted to somehow repay the kindness. Robert had to lie to every single one of them. "I don't know who it is. They want to remain anonymous. I'm sorry." It ate at him. These were grieving families. They deserved to know who had helped them in their darkest moment. But he'd promised Dean, and Dean had been very clear about the terms. "If they know it's me, it changes things," Dean had told Robert during one of their conversations. "They'll feel obligated. They'll feel like they owe me something. I don't want that. I want them to accept the help and move on with their lives. That's all." Robert understood the logic, but it was still hard.
The funerals Dean paid for covered a wide range of situations. Each one was a family in crisis. Each one was a moment of unbearable grief made worse by financial impossibility. There was the 7-year-old girl who died from leukemia in 1973. Her parents had spent everything on medical bills, experimental treatments, hospital stays. When she died, they had nothing left. Dean paid $3,400. The young father killed in a construction accident in 1976, leaving a pregnant wife and 2 toddlers. The family was already living paycheck to paycheck. The funeral would have meant eviction, hunger, utilities shut off. Dean paid $4,800. The elderly immigrant couple in 1979, whose adult son died of a heart attack at 32. They'd come to America with nothing, built a small life, never learned to navigate the American financial system. The funeral cost would have destroyed them. Dean paid $5,200. The teenage girl who died in a drunk driving accident in 1981. She wasn't the drunk driver, she was the passenger, the victim. Her family wanted to sue, wanted justice, wanted someone to pay, but first they had to bury their daughter. They couldn't afford a lawyer and a funeral. Dean paid $6,100. The Vietnam veteran who died of exposure on the streets in 1984, homeless, estranged from his family, but his sister found out and wanted to give him a proper military burial. She worked 3 jobs and still couldn't afford it. Dean paid $3,900. The house fire in 1985 that killed a mother and 3 children. The father survived, but lost everything: his family, his home, his savings. The quadruple funeral would have cost $11,000. Dean paid it without hesitation, the largest single payment he ever made. Robert had to call Dean back to confirm. Dean simply said, "The man lost his entire family. Send me the invoice."
47 stories like this. 47 families who thought they were receiving help from an abstract, anonymous donor. 47 families who never knew that Dean Martin, the singer, the actor, the celebrity, had personally saved them from financial ruin in the middle of their worst grief. Dean never asked about the families, never asked for details about who they were or what had happened, never asked to attend the funerals he paid for. He just asked for the amount owed and paid it. That was the extent of his involvement, or so Robert thought. But the impact was enormous. 47 families avoided bankruptcy. 47 families were able to give their loved ones dignified funerals without crushing debt. 47 families had their worst day made slightly less terrible by an anonymous act of generosity. Robert met Dean Martin in person exactly once. It was 1982, 12 years into their arrangement. Dean came to the funeral home late one evening when no one else was there. "Mr. Chen," Dean said, shaking his hand, "I wanted to meet you in person, to thank you for keeping my secret." "Mr. Martin, I should be thanking you, what you've done for these families." Dean interrupted him. "I don't want thanks. I want you to understand why the secrecy matters. These families are in pain, they're grieving, they're vulnerable. If they knew it was me, some of them would feel like they had to do something in return, send letters, call me, try to meet me. I don't want to add to their burden. I want them to accept the help and heal. That's all." Robert nodded. "I understand." "Good. Keep doing what you're doing and keep my secret." That was the only time they met face to face. Every other interaction was phone calls and cashier's checks. In December 1987, Dean Martin died. He was 78 years old. Robert Chen sat in his office, looking at the locked filing cabinet, and realized he was finally free to tell the truth. In March 1988, Robert was invited to speak at the National Funeral Directors Association conference in Las Vegas. He'd been asked to discuss charitable giving and community support in the funeral industry. Robert stood at the podium, looking at 300 funeral directors from across the country. "Dean Martin died 4 months ago," Robert began. "Most of you know him as an entertainer.
What you don't know is that Dean Martin paid for 47 funerals over 17 years, nearly $300,000, and he did it in complete secrecy. The room went silent. Robert told the story, the first phone call in 1970, the pattern that developed over 17 years, the absolute insistence on anonymity, the locked filing cabinet, the 47 families who never knew. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Funeral directors who'd seen everything, who dealt with death and grief for decades, were crying. After the conference, Robert decided the families deserved to know. He started tracking down the 47 families Dean had helped. Some had moved, some had died, but he found most of them. He called each one personally. "I need to tell you something about the anonymous donor who paid for your loved one's funeral." The reactions were remarkably similar. Shock, disbelief, tears. Every single family said the same thing. "We never knew. We spent years wondering. We wanted to say thank you." One woman, whose teenage daughter's funeral Dean paid for in 1975, told Robert, "We were going to lose our house. We'd already taken out a second mortgage for her medical bills. When the funeral was paid for, it saved us. We stayed in that house, raised our other kids there. I always wondered who the angel was who helped us. Now I know." A man whose father's funeral Dean paid for in 1981 said, "My dad loved Dean Martin, listened to his records all the time. If he'd known Dean Martin paid for his funeral, he would have, I don't even know what he would have done. He would have been so honored." The story spread through the funeral industry, then to the media. By 1989, it was one of the most famous stories about Dean Martin's generosity.
What made it particularly powerful was the secrecy. Dean hadn't done this for publicity, hadn't done it for recognition, hadn't done it for thanks. He'd done it specifically on the condition that nobody would ever know it was him. He'd spent $287,340 over 17 years helping families bury their loved ones, and he'd gone to his grave without ever telling anyone. Robert Chen retired in 1995. Before he left the funeral business, he gave one final interview about Dean Martin. "People ask me why Dean did it," Robert said, "why he spent so much money, why he insisted on secrecy. I think it's simple. Dean understood that death is expensive. He understood that grief is hard enough with the added stress of debt. And he understood that the best kind of help is the kind that doesn't ask for anything in return." The interviewer asked, "Did you ever regret keeping his secret?" "Every day," Robert admitted. But Dean was right. If those families had known it was him, it would have changed the nature of the gift. It would have made it about him instead of about them. By keeping it anonymous, Dean made sure the focus stayed where it belonged, on the families healing and moving forward. What do you think Dean would say if he knew you'd told everyone after he died? Robert smiled. "I think he'd be annoyed, but I also think he'd understand. These families deserve to know, and the world deserved to know what kind of man Dean Martin really was." If this story about generosity without recognition moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with anyone who needs to know that the best acts of kindness are the ones done in secret. Leave a comment about a time someone helped you anonymously, or a time you helped someone without wanting credit. And ring that notification bell for more stories about the power of giving without expecting anything in return. Dean Martin paid for 47 funerals over 17 years, spent nearly $300,000, helped families in their darkest moments, and never told a soul. Because for Dean, the reward wasn't recognition. It was knowing that somewhere a family was able to bury their loved one with dignity instead of debt.